Thank you, Steve, and special thanks also to Chris for inviting me. It's good to be with you all this evening. I know the hour is getting late, but as a sleep physician also, I know the effects of insulin and... Wake up, Brian. It was indeed a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be here and privileged to share some thoughts on a topic that has been really of enduring interest of mine for many years. But at the outset, despite what Steve just said, I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, so I don't have any particular claim or authority on this matter. However, as a physician who has reflected a great deal about the theology of the body as it speaks to practical day-to-day events, encounters, and relationships, particularly in the medical world, I think I can contribute some provocative thoughts, hopefully by the end of this presentation, answer questions and if time permits, engage in some dialogue about this topic. I'd like to begin briefly by recounting my story in coming to this magnum opus of JP2, the Theology of the Body. It was about almost 20 years ago at a meeting of the National Meeting of the Catholic Medical Association. It was held in Philadelphia at the time. It was one of the first that I went to. And is Christopher West a familiar name to people? Christopher West's book, he wasn't there, but his book was on a Pauline books table outside the meeting hall, and it caught my attention. Its title was Theology of the Body Explained. It really captivated my attention. So I bought the book and read it, and it so captivated me that I sought to hear him speak. I heard in Philadelphia he was going to be at a young adults gathering, as we did in the summer, so Theology on Tap was what was called at the time, and Christopher West was going to be there. I thought, wow, this is great. But I better call the organizer to make sure I could attend. Again, it was a young Catholics group, and this was even 20 years ago, but even then I did that. Anyway, so after the talk, I introduced myself to him, and when he learned that I was a physician, he said that I must read the entire work. I said I would try to, but it wasn't really at the top of my reading list, since at the time I was quite content with what I had learned from the explained version. Well, as Providence would have it, that was in the summer, as I said. That fall, just a few months, the pro-life union gathering in Philadelphia, Christopher West was going to be the keynote speaker. And again, on a table outside the meeting, the banquet hall, there was a flyer this time announcing that a small group seminar to study the theology of the body was going to commence that January. And I inquired about it and ended up enrolling into it. And for the next almost 2 years, a small group of us, maybe about 9 or so, met every other Tuesday it was, and we just went through the theology of the body in a very systematic way. And at the end of that experience, I was more on fire about the theology of the body and what we were given by JP2. I began thinking more and more about it as it related to the practice of medicine, and that continues to this day. I was saying to Chris at dinner, it really struck me. I mean, at the core of what we do in medicine, in nursing, and all the health professions, right, is the human body. I mean, we touch and examine, we do therapeutic interventions and so on. So how could it be that, I needed to know more about this, and this, as I said, this theology of the body was particularly intriguing to me. So I want to, over the next several minutes, discuss some of the key elements of this theology of the body. But I first want to I first want to assert, I guess I can use this as a clicker here. I want to assert the premise that there has been a collective forgetfulness, or a term used by some, a cultural amnesia, wherein a forgetting of who we are as human beings, which from a Christian anthropologic view, though I would argue simply without qualification, just simply who we really are, that is, creatures made in the image and likeness of God. And this forgetting about that, this forgetting has contributed directly and I think substantially to an identity crisis of the human person. Let's see if that does it. Nope. That? Nope. That?
We'll get it figured out.
I'm not sure which of the... This? Oh. It wasn't on. Which button? Thank you. So this crisis of identity then results in treating others in less than dignified ways. And once I want to establish this premise and the implications that derive from it, I then want to argue that if we're going to recover an abiding sense of human dignity, then we'll need to collectively remember as a culture who we are, and then secondly, show how John Paul II's Theology of the Body helps us in that recovery process and serves as an antidote in the noxious environment, which is, to use another JP2 reference, a culture of death. And to achieve this second objective, I will draw largely from my experience as a physician, steeped in the care of many patients over the years, to show how human dignity is realized in light of the theology of the body. Now, many of you know from your knowledge of church history in the late 3rd, 4th century, early 4th century, I guess, a major controversy, right? Famously stirred by Arius, concerned who Jesus is. You may recall that this was known as what? The Arian controversy, right? Was Jesus part God, part man, and if so, what proportion? And this was a huge issue at the time, a true crisis concerning the Son of God. So much so that a council was convened, right? The Council of Nicaea by Constantine, where this crisis was hashed out. Now, Arius apparently was a very influential and popular figure, but of course he was eventually sidelined, and the heresy that bears his name, Arianism, was averted. Now, the crisis at that time in the church was over who Jesus is, and over the ensuing centuries there have been many other crises and reiterations of past crises, and today a major crisis of identity, beginning perhaps in the late 17th, early 18th century with the Enlightenment, and probably peaking in the mid-20th century, still continues. Today, the crisis concerns who man is, and one expression of this crisis is found in the question, who are we? And we may find ourselves asking this question from time to time about ourselves, about others, perhaps because we aren't quite sure who we are. Perhaps we've forgotten in the deeper, abiding sense of knowing our identity, that more profound sense of knowledge necessary to live most fully in truth and in love. And I want to echo what many others have expressed and pondered, and that is that the current crisis today is one of human identity. And to put this in terms of church mission and teaching, and maybe even to think of it in terms of heresy, that is a misunderstanding or misguided teaching or interpretation of truth. As social commentator and scholar Ryan Anderson writes, the tribulations that marked the 20th century and continue into the 21st. Totalitarianism, genocide, abortion, and the sexual ideology that has battered the family and redefined marriage have sprung from a faulty humanism, a faulty anthropology, a misunderstanding of the nature of man. And Anderson, of course, here is sharing the insights learned from Karol Wojtyła and his magnificent thoughts and teachings about the human person, much, of course, as we said, found in the theology of the body. Now, as an aside, I have to share with you, I've always found it very interesting that George Weigel in Witness to Hope referred to this corpus. Does anyone know? It's sort of an obscure question. He referred to this as a theological time bomb, the theology of the body. I said that. Some of you may remember that.
Set to go off the 21st century.
Set to go off sometime in the third millennium, he said. Yes, yes. So that's interesting. What do you think of that?
I think he was had a lot of foresight.
Yeah. What does that mean?
You're gonna tell us.
Yeah, well, I don't know what it means. I think of this metaphor, from time to time. I think of what is it about a bomb set to go off? Think of like a time bomb or a bomb, just a bomb. What? It's destructive. It's destructive. It's what? Crisis. It would certainly create a crisis. Yep. Certainly would get our attention. It's hard to ignore.
Fractures the errors.
Yep, fractures the errors. Great. Yep, right. And that I was going to say, as it connotes a destructive force, what is it? And you answered that. What is it, or what would be destroyed? Right. Well, perhaps what Weigel, I'm saying, was referring to was a time bomb set to go off to destroy elements of the current state of affairs, third millennium, where there is not the abiding view of the human person, where there are practices which deride and disrespect the human person. Does that make sense? It's a thought. So it would be good to destroy, or to at least dismantle, those heretical or false understandings of the human person. So many have proposed that we are in an identity crisis, a crisis of understanding the human person, and this is at the core of undignified treatment and regard for others. It's one thing, I think, to view human dignity as an abstract reality that we all have talking points around, but the essence of why it is even important to regard human dignity has to do, I think, with not abstractions about what it means, but what its relevance is. Its, if you will, incarnational relevance is in all that we do, right? In our interactions with others, in the various spheres of our activities. So in the world that I inhabit professionally, medicine, there's been an ascendancy of a so-called technocratic model of medicine, a model which, among other features, views the human body as a machine and views the mind or one's consciousness or spirit as separate from the body. And I know the theologians in the audience are calling to mind other heresies, right? This improper dualistic view of the human person stems in large part from and is essentially rooted in, right, Gnosticism, and to some extent Manichaeism, errant philosophies which basically hold that matter is evil and that only spirit or non-bodily realities are good and true. The corollary of this, of course, is denial of the goodness and beauty of the human person, who is bodily creature. And in this regard, I often think of the dichotomy referenced by John Paul II while he was recovering in a hospital bed after his assassination attempt, He said that the essence, he said in essence, that there is a tension between remaining a subject of one's illness and becoming an object of treatment. And this objectification of the person certainly counters a Christian anthropology, as we know in the Catechism, but many, in this case Bonhoeffer, once simply put it, man does not have a body, he does not have a soul, rather he is body and soul. And not only is an improper view of the person prevalent today, in the realm of medicine, patients too easily fall into this misunderstanding of the body. Dr. Pavella brought up assisted suicide and euthanasia. We sometimes see this in the requests for assisted suicide and euthanasia. When the patient views him or herself primarily as spirit and secondarily body, and so erroneously concludes that as the body is subordinated to the spirit, if it somehow can be treated differently, especially if it burdens the real person, spirit. So you see how that can play into people's view, right? So as I mentioned, I think one of the greatest factors for many of what we encounter today in anti-life practices is a cultural amnesia, sort of collective forgetfulness culturally, at least an improper understanding of who we are, if not, frankly, forgetting who we are. And I'm suggesting that unless we remember who we are, or if we haven't forgotten, unless we maintain an understanding of who we are, we run the risk of contributing to some extent, however unintentional, to a perpetuation of indifference and desensitization to the life issues. And what I have in mind here are abortion and all the corollary issues, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, the aid in dying rhetoric, and also the emerging issues over identity and seeming epidemic of gender dysphoria. So let's look more closely at this forgetfulness. Forgetting who we are. What's the big deal? I often say to my students in particular, words matter. And so if you permit me, I'd like to just recount a little etymology here. Leaf from, is this familiar to you? I keep picking on you guys because you're from Greek mythology is one of the 5 rivers in Hades. And all who drank from it experienced complete forgetfulness. Lethe was also the name of the Greek spirit of forgetfulness and oblivion, and was often associated with the river in Hades. Okay? So in classical Greek, the word lethe literally means oblivion, forgetfulness, concealment. Okay? And lethe is also related to the Greek word for truth, which is aletheia. Father? I don't know if I'm saying it right. Aletheia, or literally unforgetfulness. Aletheia, right? Aletheia. Unforgetfulness, unconcealment. Further, this word in English is the root for the English word lethal, lethargy, forgetting, okay? So if we're talking about forgetting our identity, then by definition, we are forgetting about God. So our identity is tied to God. Get to that. So not remembering, forgetting is lethal. Is there evidence of this forgetfulness? Abortion, euthanasia, high suicide rates in those with gender dysphoria, at all stages of human life, in the beginning, at the end, and in between, there are indeed lethal consequences to forgetting who we are. So let me try to illustrate this concept by an example concerning abortion and the early medical anti-abortion rhetoric in our country. I'll just read this quote quickly. The rapid increase in abortions noticed after the 1840 census in this country was explained as a loss of essential knowledge by women. Physicians argued women were becoming dissociated from their true selves. The lost knowledge was located in the body, in the natural laws that determined health and illness. Treated as an act of forgetfulness, abortion was placed within a system of cultural mnemonics. Thus, memory, as used here, is not about the recollection of one's individual experiences or a chronicle of events, but about a reconnection with essential knowledge through unforgetting, or the Neoplatonic epistemology of anamnesis. The memory work of early medical practices, then, was addressed not only to certain individuals, but also to the culture that had forgotten its inner nature. So if we were to agree that an amnesia about who we are underlies many of the anti-life practices in our world today, then what can we do about it? Well, the short answer is remember. But how? Anamnesis. Right, in Greek philosophy, largely from Plato, anamnesis refers to a practice whereby transcendent truths or essential realities are known to us but are forgotten at birth, but then recollected through reasoning and analysis to arrive back at knowing those transcendent truths. So early in the anti-abortion period, it was part of the duty of physicians to remind women of the truth of their bodies and to remember in an anamnestic way who they were. So the remedy to forgetting who we are is to remember, but more precisely, anamnesis, recalling who we are at this deeper level, the level that accords with our nature, our essence, not just the simple remembering. And to consider the remedy as anamnesis connotes a bringing back something from within or from the past into the present, bringing back to one's mind, one's consciousness, the reality of something, in this case, one's true identity. So more than simple remembering, but remembering as in being part of, or as reliving, as we know with this term probably more commonly in terms of liturgy at Mass. Right? It has always struck me how in Psalm 137, which recounts the time the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon in a godless culture, yet they knew that they must not forget God, the holy city. Doing so would be intolerable. Doing so, as one commentator notes, would be to submit to evil, to wither and die. To remember, on the other hand, is to resist evil, to remember and live again. So what do we need to remember? Well, basically and fundamentally, the Imago Dei, right? That we are sons and daughters of God the Father, made in his image and likeness. And this leads to what I think is the greatest method for gaining and maintaining a proper understanding of the person created in the image and likeness of God. And the substratum for this understanding is the theology of the body, and an ever deepening understanding of this teaching about the person. So as I said, the theology of the body helps us recover an understanding of who we are and propels us in so many directions, making it possible to cogently, effectively, and many times powerfully assert and gain the abiding view of human dignity so much needed in a world today. So in my reflections on the theology of the body over the years in medicine, there are 5 major themes that emerge as being particularly relevant, and I just briefly want to recount them. They're listed here. The one is JP speaking of the language of the body, and more than just body language per se as we commonly think about it, but he'll speak about the body speaking a language, but the body is not the author of the language, right? The person, the self, is the author, but it's not complete. It's spoken through the body. So the body expresses that the person, okay? And we can speak of love and generosity with our body, but conversely, we can speak lies with our body by treating others as things, right, to be used and disposed of, to put it crudely. Now, from a the medicine piece, if you will, I like to bring to the fore is to recognize that illness, we encounter people with illness, that their ability to speak the language of their body, is impaired, right? Their ability to express themselves through their body may be impaired by bodily illness. And the physician then, in restoring bodily health, also heals the patient's ability to express him or herself. In addition, the physician also speaks his own language of the body by exhibiting, for example, self-giving love, fidelity to the sick, presence, speaking a language of tenderness and concern. Second major theme is that we are made in the image and likeness of God. Current medical practices may obscure this reality, this identity of the patient being created in the image and likeness of God. For example, medical personnel speaking of patients in terms of their condition or their disease or their diagnosis. Examples listed there. A surgeon may speak of doing a gallbladder, or my residents on rounds in the ICU might say, there's a drug overdose in room 222. I was like, no, you mean a person who had a drug overdose, or it's just something simple like that. So, but words matter, as I said earlier, and it's important that how we refer to patients, right, reflects our understanding of their dignity as being created in the image and likeness of God the Father. I think terms vegetative or vegetable, this came up last week with never a vegetable. No one's ever a vegetable. Vegetative state gets a little bit of play, but I think there are more appropriate ways for the clinicians in the audience. I think there are more appropriate ways to refer to people who may have severely impaired consciousness. Maybe refer to them as being in states of permanent or minimal consciousness, or states of permanent unconsciousness. I think a more felicitous term than vegetative state. So avoiding these names make it clear that the patient is a person, and the patient is not a diagnosis or a particular condition. John Paul II talks a lot in this and other writings, of course, about the body being for self-donation, right? Each embodied person being a gift of self to another. He talks about this being the spousal meaning of the body. The body's, again, capacity for expressing love and self-gift. The medical reflections on this, that the physician-patient relationship itself, it manifests as mutual self-donation in at least two ways, as listed here. The patient allows himself or herself to be cared for by the physician, and in doing so is giving the physician his vulnerability and an opportunity for service. The physician similarly may make a gift of of him or herself through their kindness, healing touch, gentle words, and so on to benefit the patient. I found this interesting along those same lines. Early on in Francis's papacy, he recognized first a crisis of the human person that I've been trying to emphasize, but then also offered a remedy for it, and that remedy was couched in the language of gift and service, as you see there in that quote. The communion of persons, a communio personarum, man reflects the image of God we reflect the image of God through our through our rationality, right? Created with intellect, will, but also our relationality, right? Made for relationships. In marriage, classic example, right? We talk about the Trinity, marriage being an icon of the Holy Trinity because of the mutual self-giving, the spousal relationships that's fruitful, generative, but also too, to stretch a little bit, to think about the patient-physician relationship forming a communion of persons, which itself can be fruitful. And lastly, a major theme having to do with the reality of shame, which is a post-fall reality, right? The result of original sin, where there's a distortion of the sense, a distorted sense of the body, and such that there's a tendency to view the body and others as objects, as we touched on earlier. And this creates a fear of being seen, John Paul said, with a gaze of use, and a need to, therefore, protect ourselves from that distorted view, potentially from others, of being looked upon as an object. So in the clinical arena, a physician, I think, does well, nurses, anyone in healthcare, I think, do well to be aware of this dynamic, to be aware of this, and to strive to live with purity of heart, such that, because I think a view will affect the manner with which we interact with patients, our speech, decisions regarding what's going to be done for them. So, a study of the theology of the body, an assimilation of what it offers us in a clear, truth-filled understanding of the human person, I think goes a long way in firmly establishing the answer to who we are. And in an animistic way, helps us not to forget the essence of our being. Well, that all sounds good, maybe, but that's not the prevailing mindset in our world. So I'd like to just take a moment to look at some of the countervailing forces in our society in the assaults on proper understanding of the human person, some of the issues and practices that deride the human person as created male and female in the image and likeness of God. And I present these threatening issues separated into three categories based on the primary mechanism by which they destroy the authentic meaning of personhood. And the categories, of course, are not mutually exclusive. So current issues and practices that deride the human person as created male and female in the image and likeness of God. Category one, those activities that blur the distinction between man and woman. These include homosexual practices, including same-sex, quote, marriage, domestic partnership arrangements, gender reassignment surgery. Category two, persons seen primarily as an object to be used. These include certain organ procurement practices for organ transplantation, possibly donation after cardiac death, embryonic stem cell research and development, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Category three, practices that rupture a communion of persons. These include various reproductive technologies, contraception, in vitro fertilization, and an erosion of medical professionalism that we see, moral relativism as well. And if I may put some context around yet another feature of assault on human dignity, consider this dynamic between domination and alienation of individuals and how it may occur in a very insidious manner. And to illustrate this, this is a quote, a professor of anthropology and sociology writing about technocratic medicine tells us that this is very interesting. I'll tell you why in a second, particularly. Power produced through technology is a form of power arising from an ability to cultivate and satisfy specific interests, values, and desires. Such power is normative, cultural, and opportunistic insofar as it privileges the needs and desires of certain groups and individuals. The consumer's need or desire for a service or product subsequently becomes the means by which those providing the services or goods gain advantage. And then when exclusive possession is held over a desirable commodity, a situation of domination is created. It's a little heavy, and that's why I put it up there, if you care to try to unpack it a little bit. I came across this about 2 years or so ago, some work I was doing, and just with this past year, and I don't want to get into it, but just with this past year in the pandemic, this really resonated with me. This whole idea of power through technology and a cultivation of want by a group to then affect a dominating a tendency for domination. So now, getting back to the human person, an improper view of the human person, which is especially conspicuous in this kind of technocratic, if you will, model of medicine, engenders a context in which the consumer's need, the consumer's need or desire for a service or product becomes the means of domination. Okay, so this kind of process, if you will, engenders a situation where a consumer's need or desire for a product becomes the means for that consumer to be dominated. And common examples in the healthcare sector include IVF, the use of contraceptives, and abortion, maybe certain cosmetic surgical procedures when they're not done for medical indications. And so within this kind of paradigm, individuals are cultivated to desire these and other commodities, right? They're cultivated to want these things, and in pursuing them, become subjected to the powers promoting them. That's that domination relationship. So just reflect for a moment on the business of assisted reproduction and the technologies applied therein, the enormous financial cost, and what I've seen in some couples, a frenzied pursuit of this commodity with seeming reckless abandon. So you can ask the question, who's really in control there? Who's wielding the power in those circumstances? So domination or control over another then leads to a situation of alienation. And so to the extent that one is dominated by another system, by another person, or a system, or an industry, one is objectified as a mechanistic part of a greater technocratic complex and becomes alienated from others and from oneself. Now, patients, just because of their illness itself, are many times alienated, but when technologies are in the mix, they may become even more so. So In closing, I'd like to make a few comments regarding overall approaches in our ongoing pro-life efforts. Has anyone heard of the Benedict option? Many people. To the extent that the Benedict option is conceived as a way of, or may be conceived as a way of settling in with like-minded folks so as to strengthen and concentrate a resistance to the perils of anti-life practices, right? A sort of circling the wagons approach, assuming a more defensive posture to resist various assaults. I'd like us to consider complementary option, an option that is perhaps more engaging of the enemy, an option that may be conceived more as an offensive action to confront ongoing assaults, an option that complements the Benedict option and that enclaves of the faithful with purified Christian ideas, values, and practices will serve as launch pads for the faithful to re-enter the world at points where they find themselves, to re-evangelize, recatechize, revitalize those they encounter. And George Weigel, in The Fragility of Order, calls this the Gregorian option, after Pope St. Gregory the Great, who himself, once leaving the world of public affairs, founded a Benedictine monastery, lived as a monk, and then eventually was called back into the public square to serve in that way. All of us in our respective roles might then engage the nefarious elements within a culture of death paradigm and perhaps find both options appealing. Having become purified and stronger through living gospel values, maybe then seek to re-enter the clinics and hospitals, perhaps the courtrooms, the civic meetings, the businesses, whatever, our respective workplace, the streets, giving even greater witness to Jesus Christ. On whichever path, though, the most fundamental antidote against these toxic elements will be to have a deep and abiding view of the human person as created in the image and likeness of God. He or she who, as we read, is very good. Only through this lens will the clinical gaze of healthcare providers towards patients be properly focused, revealing a crystal clear view of the patient as a person created and loved by the Father. Only with this view can we hope to ensure some protection against the various threats telling us otherwise, and to the forces acting contrary to this reality. In medicine, emphasis must be unwaveringly placed on the primacy of the patient as a person, not the health system, not the institution, not even the goal to eradicate disease, for as important and as laudable as a goal that is, and certainly not an arrogant quest to conquer death. The hubris which accompanies much of what we encounter today in an anti-life culture is countered only by humility, not only accepting but embracing our humanity and our proper disposition before God. Simply put, what's the antidote? Humility is the main active ingredient in all the antidotes to anti-life forces. In fact, it's the only way evil has ever completely been overcome. God who humbled himself, accepting even death on a cross. Thank you. I'd love to.
People have any questions? I have one in the medical field. You know,
Yes,
having
Steve.
taught medical residents and students for many years before I retired, how do you, when you encounter that, obviously in a group or you're making rounds, you encounter that abuse of the patient or the discussion behind the scenes. Give us some ideas, how do you bring these people down? I mean, I would have my own techniques, but tell us
Well,
how
I'd
you
like to hear.
would bring people down into this is a person, not a case.
I have to say happily, as I get older and this happens, it becomes easier because you seem to have more authority. So it says,
Great outcomes.
yeah. So I just say that. I stop and I say, what were the admissions like? Oh, there's a DKA and severe sepsis. You mean a patient with DKA? You mean a patient who has severe sepsis? So I just try to it's a little, so, that. It comes up a lot in the care, like withdrawal care. Again, words matter. I didn't get into it too much, but residents will say, we're going to withdraw care. I said, no, we're not. And they say, yeah, no, we talked to the daughter and the son. They were here and they understand what's going on. They knew we've done everything. We're going to withdraw care. And I said, no, we're not. So it's just that kind of sort of like, what's the word? Yeah, in your face, but sort of like glib kind of. But try to. But then like that. Say, no, we're not going to withdraw care. And the point I'm making there, by the way, is what? Anyone? I said we never withdraw care. We're never going to withdraw care. Well, we'll withdraw life-sustaining therapy, we'll stop the dialysis, we'll remove the ventilator, but we're always going to care for the patient because care, and you can go into the roots in that, right, where the word love and so on, caritas. So I kind of like push back a little, not push back, but say something like that might, like say, get their attention, and then follow it up with a little teaching about why we're doing this, or it came up last week with an organ donation situation, which is a whole other matter. So just trying to witness in the moment with the students. I don't know, Steve, if that makes sense. You may do it differently, and be happy to hear.
Sometimes that trying to personalize the person, like they have a wife, they have a child.
Oh yeah,
You try to put their lives
Yeah.
in context of a social context.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you get them to think, oh, this could be my dad,
Yeah.
my mother,
Yeah.
my brother, my sister. If you put them in a social context, which is social workers are good at, doctors tend to think more technologically. If you do that, sometimes you can shock them
Yeah.
into a moment
Yeah.
and say, you show
Yeah.
them that this is a person.
In relationship, right?
In
A lot of times with families, we'll use. I encourage students and residents to talk. So your mom, your dad, as we're talking with, not, using those relationships in referring to the patient exactly. Yeah. Another example that last week or the week before was I had just come on service, and there was a unknown man. He had no name. He was already in the hospital 3 days in the ICU on the ventilator before I got there. And so they're telling me the story, and so we go through it, and I just paused for a little bit, and I said, I asked a bunch of the residents there, 3 or 4 of them, and the fellow, and a couple pharmacist students. I said, how long do you think it would be if you didn't, how long do you think it would be before someone would know that you were missing? You weren't home, you weren't at work, right? But, those that weren't, some of them didn't have spouse or roommates or whatnot. And everyone was like, oh, this afternoon, or, I didn't come home tonight, or the next day, work would call. This man had been, and then I was on service for the rest of the week, a good 8 days or so, still didn't have identity. I mean, you know what I'm saying, didn't have a name. He was fingerprinted, but, that only goes so far, right? Just to step back, because it was very busy, and you go through all this stuff, but just to step back and have that little discussion with how long would it take, to emphasize, this is a person here that, so many days now had no one. Yes,
What
Chris?
In the context of the pandemic, what do you see as some of the challenges or opportunities thematically of the things you're talking about? I mean, do you see some points of connection in particular with the pandemic?
Well, there was a dearth of, right, people weren't allowed to be at the bedside, people were dying, and, nurses were holding an iPad to them. So just the base, the landscape, so to say, was ripe for people to love, strangers to love the patients because the families weren't coming in there. So it was an opportunity, and many of us did that. I was saying to Steve, I think earlier today, I mean, the nurses were unbelievable in how they just stepped up, and I mean, they typically exude sort of compassion and care, but it was to the next level, exponent for care, because that was created by the lack of care from families that were able to be there. That's what immediately comes to my mind there. Yeah. Yes.
Many times when dealing with people who are pro-abortion, they might be atheist or agnostic. So to say to them, well, you were created in the image of God, that doesn't mean anything to
Right.
them.
Yeah. I agree.
What would you say to them?
Well, I think you get to the humanity. I mean, we share all of that. I mean, what?
Their person.
Yeah. There was can I get back there, please?
Continuing the discussion that Dr. Covello said, one of my favorite quotes from Wendell Berry, who was an obvious poet, was that you cannot love the person you don't know. To love someone, you have to know them. And I'll commend my wife here, because she's super good at spending the extra time with people to get to know them. And she remembers those things better than I do. It's knowing the person that makes it easier to take care of them, that makes you see the humanity.
Mhm.
And it's what I would call slow medicine, something we don't practice anymore because we're more tied to our computer screens.
Yeah.
And putting all those elements in our note that allow us to charge more.
Yeah,
It's a real tragedy.
that it is a tragedy, but you have to push back. Push back about that, against that.
The other,
And to love people, I agree with you. You have to get to know them. But an encounter a new patient in the office a couple weeks ago. I never saw him before. You got to spend a little bit of time. Found out that he would go to a parish, a church that I used to go to, and so to get to know him, it takes time, and then you start to see that connection that you could care in a different way.
I also recall an episode that happened when I was a resident in the ICU. It was the middle of the night. A man came in who was unknown. We didn't know who this person was. They had no identification on him. Very quickly, people worked on him to try to resuscitate him, to a lot of things, but we realized he was in such severe cryogenic shock he wasn't going to survive. I went in around 3 o'clock just to see how he was doing. All of the busyness and bustle that we were doing when we first got to the emergency room and got to the unit was gone. People were quiet. I walked into the room and I learned a lesson from the nurse. He was there holding his hand as he took his last breath. And all he said to me was, "No one deserves to die alone."
Yeah.
So my hat's off to all the nurses.
Yeah. We saw so much of that in COVID. If it weren't for the nurses there at the bedside, it really. Claire?
Just struck when you were talking about it towards the end, the primacy of the patient as a person. And father of the abortion industry, 75,000 abortions, and then it was the ultrasound image of a 16-week-old baby girl. And when you saw it, what he said was, now it's a person. And that's what changed it for him. And for him, the connection was when he saw the baby wiggling her toes and sucking her thumb, and then she rolled towards the camera and she smiled, 16 weeks old.
Yeah.
And at that moment, it wasn't just even the movement of a body, but he saw the soul, he saw the baby as a child. Now, he was still an atheist. He didn't convert because of faith. It was the science, but it was a special grace, I know, from God.
Yeah.
But he saw the Holocaust there, and he said in his writings, they took away the personhood of the Jews in order to justify the slaughter of the many, and now I am the perpetrator. And the father of the abortion industry stopped doing abortions.
Yeah.
Like, it's
amazing.
amazing, but it was
Yeah.
recognizing the child
As a person. And it gets to Maria's comment, and maybe a way to get into the person who doesn't acknowledge God. Yeah, to just go to what is common with the human being as a person. Yeah, thank you. Other comments?
Do you have any other thoughts about how most of us, even students, us, we really practice sometimes alone? You know, there's very few of us that we're scattered in terms of trying to treat people as persons. Any other techniques? Is it just case by case, one by one, you try to convert people? I mean, it can be a lonely life, so to speak, for a lot of people, even at young age, and knowing that, you know, they're struggling upstream.
Yeah. It takes time. It's not hard, but it takes time. You have to be present. You know, it takes time. These competing forces of trying to get through things, get your notes done, and this and that. So I don't know. To me, a big part of to me is just spending the time with the patient, looking at the patient, discarding the computer screen. Don't even open up the file. It is.
And I also think organizations like, you know, Students for Life, Catholic Medical Association, the Life League, we band together before we go out again. You know, the Benedict option and the Gregorian option.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, very good.
Individual questions.
Okay,